On Memorial Day, we remember all of those who gave their lives in service to our country. To help us do that, I've got a suggestion. For the Colson Center, I'm John Stonestreet. This is Breakpoint. Chuck Colson never missed a single Memorial Day opportunity to remind us all to remember the fallen. Often he did so by telling the stories of those who sacrificed their lives that others might live. In just a moment, I want you to hear one such story from Chuck himself from World War II. But before we do, there's something else we should all remember. Some stories are still being written. Since 2001, nearly 7,000 American service members have died overseas in any number of conflicts. So far this year, that number is 16. And their stories need to be heard as well. More on that in just a moment. First, here's Chuck Colson.
It was February 1945, 3 months before the end of World War II. 18-year-old Sergeant Joseph George was stationed in Lorient, France. It was evening, and George was preparing to go on patrol. The Americans were hoping to locate landmines buried by the Germans. Sergeant George had been on patrol duty the night before. As he told his friend Private James Caudill, he was tired and scared. Private Caudill offered to take the patrol on his behalf. He pointed out that at age 36, he was nearly 2 decades older than George. He told George, who had already been blown off a torpedoed ship, to go home and live a full, rich life. And then Private Caudill went out on patrol. A few hours later, he was killed by a German sniper. The actions of Private Caudill echo the values and valor of generations of military men and women we remember today. And it's an example of the sort of behavior we almost take for granted when it comes to our men and women in uniform who fight just wars. What's a just war? One that is defined as providing a proportionate response to evil, to protect non-combatants, among other considerations. Today, our military men and women around the world are fighting to resist evil. Ridding the world of Islamofascism by just means is a good and loving act. This willingness to sacrifice on behalf of our neighbors is why military service is considered such a high calling for Christians, and part of what makes just wars just. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica puts his discussion of just war in his chapter on charity, the love of God and neighbor. John Calvin agreed. He called soldiering justly a godlike act because it imitates God's restraining evil out of love for his creatures. A world in which free nations refuse to fight just wars would be a world where evil is unchecked and where the strong would be free to prey on the weak, as we're now seeing in Darfur. Which brings me back to Sergeant George. Joseph George came safely home to West Virginia. He married, fathered 5 sons. One of them, Princeton professor Robert George, is a good friend of mine. He's devoted much of his life to fighting the moral evils of our time: abortion, embryonic stem cell research, and efforts to redefine marriage in a way that would destroy it. In John 15:13, Jesus said, "Greater love has no man than this, that he lay his life down for his friends." The story of Private Caudill and Sergeant George makes one realize more deeply what a tremendous gift this is. It's why the George family, who are devout Catholics, have remembered Private Caudill in prayers for 61 years. Today, Memorial Day, we ought to remember the sacrifices of all the Private Caudills in all the wars Americans have fought, and we should pray for those who are still in the field, laying down their lives for each other, for us, and for the freedom of strangers. That's a very Christian thing to do.
John Stonestreet here again. Today, American servicemen and women are still making the ultimate sacrifice. Please pray for their families, and in their honor today, why not read their stories? The Military Times website has a photo and a brief story of each and every service member who has perished abroad since 2001. Come to Breakpoint.org, click on this commentary, and I'll link you to the Military Times site and to those stories of the ones who still today are giving their all. For Breakpoint, I'm John Stonestreet.